Hello, welcome to Today in Bad Theology Special Election Apocalypse Edition. Today in Bad Theology, I want to look at some apocalyptic claims being made by some Christian evangelists as we get close to the United States federal and state elections in early November of 2020. Now, the story that really set this off was a claim made by famous televangelist Pat Robertson about a week prior to filming this video, in which he claimed that he's had a vision that Donald Trump will be reelected as president. There will be violence following that, and then after about 5 years, an asteroid will strike the Earth. It would be very easy to laugh at this sort of thing, except it is quite a popular way of thinking about things. This kind of apocalyptic thinking is prevalent in Christianity, and it's prevalent because it's a major part of Christianity. But the way Pat Robertson is going about it is indeed bad theology. Now, what is apocalyptic theology? The word apocalypse was most famously, we translate as revelation. Something about God is revealed. Something about reality is revealed. But that's just too simple an explanation here. Apocalyptic literature arises from people who are absolutely beyond hope. The situation has grown dire. They are oppressed. Their faith life is censored, persecuted. They are in serious trouble. And they are at such an extreme that they need something or someone else to save them. In apocalyptic literature, the world is such a mess. What the apocalypse reveals is how evil the current situation is compared to how good God is. And God must come and set everything right. And in fact, there's nothing anybody can do about it. They can just wait for God to come. That's apocalyptic literature. The first apocalyptic book you encounter when reading the Bible, book that is entirely apocalyptic, is the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel, scholars think, is written during the time that Judah would have been under the occupation of the Syrian kings, the Seleucids, and especially during the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes, the king, who demanded that he be worshipped as a god and who made life a living hell for the people of Judah. That this book was written in response to this terrible situation. Apocalyptic thinking is probably most famous in the New Testament in the book of Revelation, again, written from what we think is a situation of persecution or at least serious trouble, a church that finds itself helpless in a very difficult and painful world, and sees hope in the sense that God might come and sort everything out. Now, some people like to just get rid of these apocalyptic books. Now, if you want to get rid of apocalypses, you got to get rid of some other places too. Wonderful funeral imagery that we borrow from the book of Isaiah. There's an Isaiah apocalypse, the great banquet at the end of the world. God has sorted things out. And there's an apocalypse on the lips of Jesus in 3 of the Gospels. Jesus, shortly before his crucifixion and death, speaks apocalyptically. We get this sense that there will be a conflict. The world is so messed up that God must come and save it, and it will happen. So, apocalyptic thinking is part of Christianity. It's in our scriptures. You can't just get rid of it and decide we're not going to deal with that part of the Bible. I mean, you can, but once you start picking and choosing what you're going to do, you're open to the criticism of you're just throwing out the parts you don't want to think about. But remember, that apocalyptic thinking is coming from people who are out of hope. Right? Gospel of Mark, the first gospel written, probably, I think, is written shortly after the temple is knocked down in the year 70. Some scholars put it a little bit earlier, but it's likely during or in the immediate wake of what's called the Jewish War, when Judah was overrun by Roman armies and ultimately Jerusalem taken. It had been occupied for centuries before, but now things had gotten terribly violent. That sense of what do we do? It's also likely written in the wake of persecutions, even executions and martyrdoms in Rome. Major figures in the church have been killed for nothing. What do we do? This is a church that is weak, helpless, that embraces apocalyptic thinking. And that brings me to my next piece, which is apocalypse in the hands of those who are not hopeless becomes dangerous. First way it's dangerous, in apocalyptic thinking, we're helpless. We have no power. If you were to use every ounce of strength you had against whatever it is that's oppressing you, you would have no impact on it. You probably would only harm yourself. It'd be like trying to pummel a brick wall with your fists. Unless the wall is structurally unsound, you're just going to wind up with busted hands. But when apocalyptic thinking is in the hands of those who actually have some power, even if it's just a little bit, well, that kind of desperate action inflicts a lot more damage than it would otherwise. The image here that I think might be helpful is it's like picking up a suitcase that is empty when you thought it was full, right? When you act from an apocalyptic point of view but actually have power, your lashing out at your perceived enemies causes a great deal of harm that you might not have been able to cause otherwise. You are capable of causing damage. The audience of apocalyptic literature is not capable of causing damage. So that's the sort of first point that's troublesome here. When you have any kind of power in the world and you act out of an apocalyptic worldview, your actions are disproportionate to the rest of the world. They're too violent. Second thing that comes about when you put apocalyptic thinking in the hands of those who have some power is apocalyptic thinking is like escapism in a lot of ways, right? The only thing that the hopeless have left is that when it ends, I'll be with God, right? There's nothing left. My only hope at this point is that I will be with God when it's all over. But if you have some power, you have other things you could hope for. You could hope for a nice dinner. You could hope for your team winning the event. You could hope for relative stability in the world. You act as though you have no power, but you really do have power. Like I said in the previous section, your actions are disproportionate and they have terrible consequences, right? But you act like there aren't any, right? The problem is you act like there won't be consequences to what you do. And so, in apocalyptic thinking, for example, one of the most common ways apocalyptic thinking manifests itself in the world today is with the Christian Zionist movement, which states that God needs a nation-state of Israel in possession of the temple in Jerusalem so that Jesus can return and the world will end. This is separate from Jewish Zionism, which says God wants us to be a nation-state in Israel. Christian Zionism wants Israel to be there and take power so that God will come back and destroy the Jews for being Jewish instead of Christian. And of course, the Jewish Zionists are like, well, we don't think that's going to happen. We'll take your money and your support, but we also are pretty sure that that's not how things are going to work out. It's a whole other topic. But the consequence of that action is a foreign policy that in the United States that has to adhere to what Israel wants, and a foreign policy that often has consequences around the Middle East. Why did we side with Israel? It's not simply the power of a Jewish lobby. There is a sense among some in our government and some in our legislature that this is actually God's work to help expedite the end of time. And so we don't care who gets hurt in the process, especially people who were living in Palestine before the modern nation-state of Israel was formed. Palestinians were living there. We have removed them against their will. This apocalyptic thinking has said they don't matter. There are no real consequences because the world's going to end pretty soon anyways. And you see this manifest in lots of ways. Famously in the Left Behind series, people rush out and buy gas-guzzling SUVs. Why? It doesn't matter. The world's going to end. You can pollute it however you like. It's escapism. And when you have no power to harm the world around you because you are being harmed to the point that you have no hope, escapism is hope. But if you have power to damage the world around you, escapism becomes you acting without any concern for the consequences. That can be very dangerous. Third point, and I've hinted at this already in the previous one, when we have some power and we think apocalyptically, we are tempted to expedite whatever salvation God is going to bring to us. This runs contrary to apocalyptic thinking. In apocalyptic thinking, we are powerless. We can't do anything about it. That's the whole point. But when we have some power, we decide maybe we could help move things along. So we look to apocalyptic literature and say, oh, wow, this is a roadmap to God coming back. If we can just get certain events to happen, we can expedite God's return. And so you get actions that are designed to force God's hand, to bring about the end of the world faster. This always happens at cost to somebody, right? Somebody who does not believe that God is just about to show up and end things and was getting along pretty well until you showed up and decided that they were in the way. So as we try to expedite the end of the world, we always hurt someone in the process. And that brings me to the fourth problem when you put apocalyptic thinking in the hands of those with any kind of power, is we think of ourselves as being in the Lord's army. We are going to fight the fight alongside God. Now, I've said this repeatedly. I'll say it again. Apocalyptic literature and apocalyptic theology is for those who have no capacity to fight in the world. And so it is not appropriate to take on this role of I'm going to play a part in God's destroying of the enemy. Once we've decided we're going to be part of God's avenging army, well, now we think we have religious justification to act without consequences, to expedite the end of things, and to act with disproportionate power in the world. And we can take out whoever is standing in the way of God. Of course, whoever is standing in the way of God by this point is whoever we decide is standing in the way of God. So this is immediately bad theology. The whole idea of love your neighbor as yourself, the core of Christian faith, gets thrown out, becomes do unto others so that God will come back. Do horrible things to people to expedite the end. This kind of thinking is common, especially in American Christianity. And we see it here in the run-up to the election. When Pat Robertson says that he believes there's going to be violence following the election, he is not merely looking at a political landscape that is divided. I might look at a political landscape that is divided. I might look at a president who has urged some of his supporters to take up arms and intimidate people at the polls, who has urged people to reject any result that does not have him winning, and say, there's a pretty good possibility there's going to be some violence following this election day. But that's not what Robertson's doing. Robertson is attempting to prophesy this will happen, right? Because he ties this then to God's work in sending a comet to end the world. The implication being the events of apocalyptic Scripture are going to play out in our own time right in front of us. And you see this not just with Robertson, but in other places. The shadowy corners of YouTube and the internet are full of people declaring that this sort of apocalyptic end times are coming with the election. We are hurtling towards the end. There will be violence. There will be signs. And it's always just vague enough that they don't actually tell you to do anything. So you can pencil in whatever group you want to hurt. That's the brilliance of this kind of bad theology. It allows you to insert your enemies into it. You can pick whoever you want to be the ones you have to go hurt. It's the same principle as, one of the most successful novels in this century is the Twilight Saga, right? And famously, the lead character, Bella Swan, is not really described in any detail. We don't know what she looks like. And the reason is the author wants everyone reading the book to think, well, I could be Bella Swan. So that this way, every woman reading the book could see herself as being the main character and gets roped into it and enjoys the book. And it's Twilight. It's not good literature. It's not dangerous, right? It's just Twilight. It's a good technique for writing. Encourage the reader to find themselves in the story and want to see how they turn out. You put apocalyptic theology in the hands of people who are powerful, and Pat Robertson's a powerful man. And it's already dangerous theology. And now you disseminate it to everybody and encourage them to plug whoever they hate into the gaps in what you've told them. It becomes a call to violence against, it's going to be against those who have no power. It's going to be violence against the weak. It's going to be violence against whoever I don't like. And we tend to pick on people who are weaker than we are, who we know we can beat. So it's going to be those who have nothing. Apocalyptic theology here, as we close in on this election day, is bad theology because it encourages checking out of the world. Don't care what happens. Don't care what consequences there are to the vote, because ultimately God is going to come and whisk me away, and in the meantime, I can make that come faster by harming as many of you as I can. Apocalyptic theology, as we close in on the 2020 election, encourages us to harm one another instead of to love one another. Love one another is the greatest commandment. Some call it the second greatest. They differentiate between it and love God. The fact is, you can't have one without the other. If you love God, love your neighbor. Don't decide they're the problem and then justify hurting them by plugging yourself into apocalyptic theology. Now, there are all kinds of reasons that people might plug themselves into apocalyptic theology when it's not for them. It can give you a sense of incredible power. I have the right to act the way that I want. It can also be because you do notice your power slipping. If you were once more powerful than your neighbors than you are now, you might think you're on the receiving end of oppression. It's not necessarily the case. It could just be that your neighbors are more equal to you than they once were. But that can be all it takes to trigger your idea that I am losing my ground, I must be on the receiving end of oppression, and I'm gonna find safety in the apocalypse. Almost nobody needs apocalyptic theology. Almost. There are places in life where the promise of apocalypse is good theology. One of the most common is at a funeral. When we are mourning the irrevocable death of a loved one, what can we do? We can hope that God will win. Or when we are ministering to those who are dying, who know this is the end, what is left for you to do? We can say, hope. God does win in the end. These are situations where somebody needs apocalyptic theology. Or when someone is legitimately so oppressed that they are to the point of hopelessness, that there is nothing they can do but to trust that God will fix things. That's just usually not you and me. That's it for today in Bad Theology. This might be the last one before our presidential election. It's been an interesting year, this 2020, and an interesting cycle. I'll join you again as time permits. Pastor's work during a pandemic continues to be far more stressful than we thought possible, and the pandemic shows no sign of stopping, so I'll be cooped up with my video camera and bringing you more Bad Theology.